Blue Dilly Monster. When Dillon Reservoir was completed in the early 1960s, it seemed an unlikely place for legends. The lake was man-made, carved into the mounds of Summit County to provide water for Denver, and at first the talk was all about engineering and the skill of the project. But not long after its creation, stories began to circulate about something else inhabiting those waters. Boaters told of ripples rising on windless nights, fishermen spoke of sudden swells that tugged at their lines, and kayakers claimed to feel unseen forces pushing them forward when the surface around them was perfectly still. Out of those scattered accounts, a figure took shape, and locals began to call it Blue Dilly, the monster of Dillon Reservoir. And one of the most often repeated encounters that I want to add came from a couple who had taken kayaks out near Frisco Bay. It's said that they had paddled to a small island to eat dinner and planned to return by moonlight, but clouds rolled in ahead of a storm. As they started back, the wife's kayak suddenly surged ahead on the flat water. Her husband, surprised, called out, "Where did you get your speed?" expecting her to laugh. Instead, she turned to him with a pale expression and said, "I didn't even paddle." Moments later, he felt the same force as his own kayak shot forward, carried by something beneath the surface. The two of them were pushed along in bursts as though swells were rising and falling beneath their boats, though the lake remained calm around them. They then made it back to the marina just before the storm broke, shaken up by the whole experience. The attendant brushed it off as probably just the wind, then added with a grin, "Or maybe Blue Dilly pushed you." They laughed along, but when they returned home, the wife handed her husband a sketch she had made of what she saw below the kayak: a wide gray body with a fin and what looked like a flat hand or claw moving through the water. "That's what pushed me," she explained. "It was the Blue Dillon monster." But yeah, descriptions of the creature can vary, but many accounts settle on a grayish-blue body shaped like a ray, wide and flat with one large fin that cuts the water, and occasionally the suggestion of a hand or claw beneath the surface. And what sets it apart from other lake monsters is how rarely it is actually seen. More often, Blue Dilly is felt through the sudden propulsion of a boat or the rise of a wake with no visible cause. Some who claim to have studied the phenomenon argue that the creature might reach extraordinary sizes, perhaps as long as 60 feet, though such measurements are based more on speculation and local lore than hard evidence. Some say the roots of the legend lie in older mountain traditions, stories of hidden creatures that lingered in alpine lakes long before the dam was built. Others dismiss it as nothing more than misread currents or tricks of light, yet the persistence of the tale suggests something might be more enduring. What began as a few odd ripples on a new reservoir grew into a mystery that locals and visitors alike still talk about, a presence felt in the deep water of Dillon that continues to stir interest every time another boat is nudged forward without warning. Ghosts of Cheesman Park. Cheesman Park in Denver looks like an ordinary city park filled with joggers, families, and visitors enjoying the open lawns and the white marble pavilion. Yet, for decades, it has carried a reputation as one of the most haunted places in Colorado, and that reputation comes from its origins as a cemetery and the disturbing way the dead were moved when the land was converted into a park. The ground first opened in 1858 as Prospect Hill Cemetery. Over time, it grew to include sections for different groups, including a Catholic burial ground called Mount Calvary. By the late 1800s, the cemetery had become run down, overgrown, and badly neglected, and city leaders wanted to reclaim the space for public use. Congress eventually agreed, and in 1890, the land was redesignated for a park. That decision left a problem of thousands of graves that still lay beneath the soil. Families were told they had a limited amount of time to move their loved ones, but most of the people buried there were poor, immigrants, or criminals, and few were claimed. In 1893, the city hired undertaker E.P. McGovern to remove the remaining bodies. What followed quickly became a scandal. Paid by the coffin, McGovern realized he could make more money by hacking bodies into smaller pieces and placing them into several child-sized caskets rather than moving each corpse intact. Newspapers at the time described scenes of broken coffins, bones and clothing scattered across open pits, and body parts trampled underfoot. The public was horrified and McGovern was dismissed before the job was done, but by then the damage had been done. Many bodies were never properly removed and construction of the park simply continued over ground that still held human remains. The mishandling of the cemetery left a mark that locals never forgot, and from it grew the stories that gave Cheesman Park its haunted reputation. Visitors began to claim they heard moaning or crying at night, or that they saw misty shapes moving across the lawns. Some spoke of shadowy figures that vanished when approached, or the ghostly laughter of children playing before fading into silence. In some accounts, people described feelings of unease or dread when walking the grounds after dark, as though they were being watched. Others claimed that on bright nights, you could still make out the faint outlines of graves beneath the grass. These stories deepened as time passed, and residents in the surrounding Capitol Hill neighborhood, itself considered one of the most haunted in Denver, often tied strange experiences to the park. Even into the 20th century, when work crews dug in certain areas, they occasionally uncovered bones and fragments of coffins, reminders that the ground had never been fully cleared. Each discovery renewed belief that the spirits of the disturbed dead still lingered. The Cheesman Pavilion, built in 1909, added elegance to the park, but it also gave ghost stories a focal point. People said figures were sometimes seen near the pavilion steps at night, or that the whispers carried on the wind when the grounds were empty. The later addition of the Denver Botanic Gardens on the adjacent Mount Calvary land brought its own finds of human remains, further fueling the sense that the dead had never really left. Today, Cheesman Park is a well-loved public space, yet it remains tied to its darker past. Guides included on ghost tours, locals share tales of strange sights after sundown, and the park's history makes it easy to believe that restless spirits might wander there. But yet, the mix of fact and legend is what really keeps the mystery alive. Angel of Shavano. Each spring, as the snows begin to recede from the high slopes of the Sawatch Range, an image takes shape on the eastern face of Mount Shavano. What appears is a vast snowfield marked by deep gullies and ridges that resembles a kneeling angel with wings stretched wide. For people in the upper Arkansas Valley, this figure has long been tied to stories of sacrifice, prayer, and the cycles of water that keep life going in the mountains and plains below. The most familiar tale tells of a drought so severe that the streams dried and game disappeared. A young native woman is said to have gone to the base of the mountain to plead for relief. The spirits answered her prayer, but demanded her life in return. She accepted, and her form became the angel on the mountainside. Each spring, as the snow melts, it's said that she weeps for her people, and those tears rush down as rivers to bring the valley back to life. Another version brings in Chief Shavano of the Tabagooch Utes, for whom the peak is named. In this telling, the chief prayed for an injured friend, and the spirits marked their answer with the image of an angel high on the slopes. Later variations added different figures, even casting the Roman god Jupiter as the one who transformed a young woman into the angel of snow and ice. Each legend has its own details, but all return to the same core idea, that the angel appears as a sign of sorrow, sacrifice, and the gift of water. The earliest maps of the region in the 1870s recorded the peak's name, though not always consistently. Geologist Ferdinand Hayden's 1873 survey used Shavano, while another military map labeled it Usher Peak. The official name settled on Shavano after the Ute leader whose people were being forced from their lands during that same period. Accounts describe the grief of the Utes as they were removed from Colorado in the early 1880s, with their prayers and tears tied in memory to the mounds they were leaving behind. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, miners and settlers had taken notice of the angel. Major Roman Jewell, a mining manager, wrote in 1916 that the snow figure could be seen clearly from Salida, shaped by gullies that held snow later into the year. Newspapers also added their own interpretations, some calling the figure a bright angel of blessing, others likening it to a fallen spirit. The image became well known when photographer Henry Hay captured it on film, and his picture was printed as far away as London. Writers described the angel as though she were lifting her face to the sky, her arms raised in supplication, calling down blessings on the valley below. The 1920s saw the figure move firmly into popular culture. Denver poet Arthur Chapman, known for Out Where the West Begins, published verses about an angel that were carried in papers across the country. Local painters, musicians, and writers drew inspiration, one even composing an orchestral piece titled The Snow Angel. Businesses followed suit, with a lettuce brand taking its name from the angel and tourist campaigns pointing travelers towards Salida to see the mountain each spring. School children also shaped the story too. In 1930, a Salida High School junior named Corinne Harpending wrote her own version of the legend. With echoes of classical mythology, she described Jupiter punishing a lesser goddess by binding her to the mountain. Only when tragedy moved her tears would she release water to the people below. In this version, the angel spends the winter watching over the land, and in summer she breaks apart into streams and rivers that flow down into the Arkansas Valley. Through photographs, poems, and local promotion, the angel of Shavano became fixed in the cultural landscape. The U.S. Geological Survey too eventually marked the angel on topographic maps, acknowledging what generations of valley residents already knew by sight. But yeah, all in all, through photographs, poems, and local promotion, the angel of Shavano became fixed in the cultural landscape. The Legend of Silverheels. When a woman named Silverheels first arrived in Buckskin Joe in 1861, the mining camp was already a rough, noisy place filled with fortune seekers, gamblers, and drifters. She stepped off the stagecoach wearing slippers inlaid with silver on the heels and a veil across her face, a detail that set her apart from the others in town. She took up a cabin across the creek and soon found work at Billy Buck's saloon. When she unveiled herself, the men of South Park said hers was the most beautiful face they had ever seen, and her skill as a dancer quickly made her famous across the region. Whether her name came from the shoes she wore into town or from a miner who fashioned her a pair with actual silver in the heels, the name Silverheels spread quickly. For months, she was at the center of the town's social life. The miners, who lived under harsh conditions in the mountains, spent their nights watching her dance and compete for her attention. But in the early 1860s, the arrival of two men driving sheep through the South Park Valley brought with it a smallpox outbreak that devastated Buckskin Joe and nearby camps. Many of the women and children fled toward Denver to escape the disease, yet Silverheels stayed behind. She went from cabin to cabin, tending to the sick miners, comforting those on the verge of death, and caring for men who otherwise would have been left alone. Eventually, though, she too caught the disease. When the epidemic passed and the surviving miners gathered a collection of money as thanks for her selfishness, they went to her cabin only to find it deserted. No one knew where she had gone. The most enduring version of the legend claims that her beauty had been destroyed by smallpox scars, and rather than face the world again, she vanished into the mountains. For years afterward, some claimed to see a veiled woman in black wandering the cemetery at night, kneeling at the graves of those she had nursed. The miners never forgot her sacrifice, and unable to give her the gift they had raised, they decided the best tribute was to give her name to one of the peaks that rose above South Park. Then, by the mid-1860s, maps of Colorado showed Mount Silverheels, a solitary summit of nearly 13,829 feet standing along the Continental Divide. From its slopes, one can see Fairplay, Jefferson, Como, and the wide valley of South Park, places where Silverheels had once lived and worked. Today, the story remains one of Colorado's most well-known mining camp legends. The town of Buckskin Joe is long gone, but Mount Silverheels still stands as a memorial to the dance hall girl who, according to legend, put aside her own safety to care for dying miners and then disappeared without a trace. Some believe she died alone in the mountains, others that she lived out her days quietly in another town, but regardless, her name remains tied to the peak that watches over the valley she once called home. Curse of the Boulder Valley. So this story begins with Chief Naiwa, whose name means left hand, and who was the leader of the Southern Arapaho during the years when settlers and prospectors first began pushing into Colorado's Front Range. He was known not only for his influence among his own people, but also for his ability to communicate with outsiders, since he had learned English through his sister's husband, the trapper John Poisel. Each winter, he returned with his community to Boulder Valley, where Valmont Butte rose above the plains. For the Arapaho, this place carried deep spiritual meaning, a landmark tied to ceremony and tradition, and one that marked their long connection to the land. Then, in the autumn of 1858, when gold seekers under Captain Thomas Aikens rode west from Fort St. Vrain and set up camp where Boulder Creek spilled from the mountains onto the plains, Naiwa rode down with two of his trusted men, Barehead and Many Whips, to meet them. The prospectors had chosen ground that lay close to Valmont Butte, and the intrusion was immediately understood as more than temporary. Naiwa addressed them directly, explaining in plain terms what would later become known as his curse, that anyone who saw the beauty of the valley would wish to stay, but in staying they would bring about the ruin of that very beauty. His words were not simply poetic warning, but a recognition of what settlement meant, a vision of the transformation that would follow if outsiders remained. Following all of that, tension had mounted quickly. Naiwa urged the men to leave, warning that a war party would soon come against them if they had refused. Barehead and Many Whips departed to rally fighters after that, leaving Naiwa to keep watch. During this time, the prospectors sought to sway him, offering food from their supplies and pressing alcohol on him until his resolve weakened. When the Arapaho warriors finally returned prepared for battle, they found their leader speaking in favor of peace, though the camps remained on edge and suspicion hung in the air. After several days, Naiwa returned again with a message shaped not by bargaining but by prophecy. A shaman of his people had dreamed of a great flood that drowned the Arapaho while sparing the newly arrived settlers. Naiwa interpreted this as a sign that waves of settlers would overwhelm the valley no matter how much his people had resisted. Fighting, he realized, would only hasten their destruction. Peace, however difficult, was the only chance for survival. Along with Little Raven, another chief who had chosen a similar path in the Denver area, Naiwa accepted that coexistence was the only course left open. It was from these events that the story of Naiwa's curse grew, told in different forms across generations. Some versions say he foretold that those who laid eyes on the valley would never truly leave it behind, always drawn back by its beauty. Others preserved the darker phrasing that those who stayed would inevitably undo the very landscape that had compelled them to remain. But whether or not Niwot spoke the words in exactly this way, the sentiment outlived him, carried forward as both warning and explanation for the restless pull the valley exerts on those who come to it. And the years that followed also brought the tragedy Niwot had feared. In November 1864, after rising tensions and the murder of a settler family, Colorado's governor ordered that all tribes be treated as hostile. The Southern Arapaho, alongside the Cheyenne led by Black Kettle, believed they had been promised safety near Fort Lyon. They camped along the Big Sandy River, flying both the American flag and white flags of truce above their lodges. Then, at dawn on November 28th, Colonel John Chivington led a militia attack that became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. More than 100 women, children, and elders were killed, and Niwot himself was mortally wounded, dying soon after. With his death, the curse gained greater weight, remembered not only as a prophecy about the valley's beauty, but also as a reflection of the fate of his people. For many who settled in Boulder afterward, the words came to mean that the valley holds its visitors in place, pulling them back if they leave. Yet the other side of the saying, that beauty is undone by those who claim it, remains visible in the history of settlement and the long consequences of that first meeting along Boulder Creek. Legend of the Blue Mist. In the mounds above Estes Park once lived a man who became a source of wonder. His name was William Clyde Kearns, though locals knew him simply as Miner Bill. He arrived from Nebraska in 1883 and spent his life drifting between town and the high slopes of Mount Chapin. Some thought him eccentric, others mad, but nearly everyone agreed his life carried an air of mystery. Concerns about his mind became serious in December 1904 when acquaintances had taken him to the Montezuma County Jail. A doctor declared him the most disturbed patient he had ever seen, and Miner Bill was bound hand and foot. At his hearing, those who knew him testified that he often spoke of astrology and divine matters. He was then confined for a year at the Colorado State Insane Asylum, and upon release, he returned immediately to prospect in the mounds. Bill spent months in the Horseshoe Park area and eventually filed 2 claims on the west side of Mount Chapin, near a rock outcropping later called Miner Bill's Spire. Geologists dismissed his efforts, but he persisted and began carving a trail up the mountainside. What seemed like the obsession of a troubled mind produced a surprisingly solid and carefully engineered path, durable enough that traces remain today. When Rocky Mountain National Park was created in 1915, Miner Bill had clashed with federal authorities. He was ordered to stop cutting trees, and when Fall River Road was built, he complained it interfered with his claim. Disagreeing so strongly, he strung barbed wire across the road, was arrested, and released after promising not to repeat it. Still, he pushed back, cutting timber, raising cabins he called snowshoe and hack mandy, and fencing land. Then, around 1930, an attorney forced him off the claim and into Estes Park. Life in town proved uneasy for him. His habit of talking to himself kind of bothered people, and he survived in barns and makeshift shelters during the cold months. F.O. Stanley, who was the owner of the Stanley Hotel and famed for the Stanley steamer, gave him odd jobs now and then, but they did little to ease his poverty. But what disturbed people the most, though, was not his muttering, but his insistence on visions he claimed to witness near his cabins. He spoke of a glowing blue mist that would drift among the trees on cloudy nights. This strange presence, he said, left behind 3-toed claw marks in the snow and on tree trunks, and nearby animals were sometimes found stripped to bone. Bill had believed it was connected to rhyolite crystals he had uncovered while digging for ore, convinced that in breaking the earth he had released something ancient that should have remained trapped. Then came the day when Miner Bill no longer appeared in town. After more than a week of absence, curiosity pushed a retired army officer named Louis O'Riordan to investigate. He hiked to Bill's cabin snowshoe and returned with grim news. Bill and his dog were both dead, with their remains reduced to bones held together by scraps of sinew. Around them in the snow were the tracks of some unknown creature marked clearly by 3 toes. The story of Miner Bill and the Blue Mist was then whispered among locals for years, and though many dismissed it as the ramblings of an unstable man, others could not ignore the details. A hermit carving lasting trails into the mounds, his strange talk of divine visions, and finally the eerie death that seemed to echo the very things he had warned about, all of it lingered. Even today, most visitors to Rocky Mountain National Park never hear the story, though some who know of it still hike the trail Miner Bill carved, standing among the remains of his cabins and wondering what he truly saw on those nights when the blue mist drifted across the slopes of Mount Chapin. Deadman's Cave Treasure. In the winter of 1880, 3 prospectors, E.J. Oliver, S.J. Harkman, and H.A. Melton were working the mounds a few miles north of where Deadman Camp would later be established. As the sky darkened and the threat of a blizzard closed in, the men abandoned their search for ore and looked desperately for shelter. Across the canyon, they spotted a narrow fissure in a sheer rock wall and forced their way inside with torches to guide them. The opening was cramped and low, but after crawling through, they found themselves in a wide chamber nearly 20 feet long. Their torchlight ended up revealing scattered skeletons, at least 5 in total, lying forgotten in the dust. Venturing deeper, they found several side tunnels, one of which opened into a vast cavern with shelves carved into the stone. On those shelves lay heavy, odd-shaped stones. When they examined one more closely, they realized it was no ordinary rock but a roughly cast bar of gold. When the storm finally broke, the 3 men carried 5 bars with them across the pass into Silver Cliff, where the gold was assayed and valued at $900 each, which was a fortune in that day. Word spread quickly and the prospectors found themselves the center of attention. Yet no amount of prodding could make them reveal where the treasure had been discovered. They insisted that the cave would remain their secret, intending to return in spring once the snow had melted. But when they did return, the mountain landscape seemed to have shifted. Crevices and ridges blurred together, and though they searched repeatedly, the mouth of the cavern could not be found. Year after year, they returned to the same slopes, certain that they were close, yet the cave remained hidden. Their original discovery was reported at the time in both the Fair Play Flume and the Denver Times, and the gold bars themselves were witnessed by many. In the years since, the story of Deadman's Cave has grown into one of Colorado's great lost treasure legends. It's interesting because some accounts even suggest that hundreds of gold bars may have been hidden deeper within, marked with symbols of Spanish origin, hinting at smelting operations centuries earlier. Others, though, point to the skeletons as evidence that the cave's riches were tied to violence or betrayal, the bones of those who once guarded or concealed the hoard. Whatever its origin though, the gold has never been found again, despite generations of searching. Somewhere high in the wet mounds, perhaps near the ridges that connect to Cripple Creek's famous gold fields, the cavern is said to wait, with its shelves still stacked with bars of Spanish gold, and its silent chambers watched over by the bones of the dead. Mystery of the Anasazi. The ancestor Puebloans, once known as the Anasazi, lived for many centuries in the dry plateaus and canyon lands of the American Southwest. Their settlements stretched across what is now Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. They built villages of stone and adobe, sometimes with hundreds of rooms, and carved entire homes into cliff faces where sheer walls offered both shelter and protection. They developed irrigation systems to grow corn, beans, and squash, and they traded widely, carrying turquoise, shells, and other goods along routes that connected distant peoples. Among their most remarkable achievements were the large complexes at Chaco Canyon, where multi-storied great houses and ceremonial kivas were laid out in patterns aligned with the sun and stars, and the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, where entire communities were tucked into rock alcoves. These sites, still standing today, reflect an understanding of engineering, astronomy, and agriculture that allowed them to flourish in an unforgiving environment. But then, near the end of the 1200s, something changed. For reasons that remain debated, these once thriving settlements were abandoned. Tree ring studies point to decades of drought that would have devastated crops. Archaeological evidence suggests possible conflicts with burned structures and signs of violence in some sites. Other researchers point to resource depletion, as years of farming and cutting wood may have strained the land. Still, others believe migration played a role, with groups moving south and east to join other Pueblo peoples in areas with more reliable water. But yet, the disappearance of the ancestor Pueblons has left a mystery that has lasted for centuries. Their homes, towers, and kivas remain silent, yet their descendants, the modern Pueblo tribes, still live in the region and carry forward cultural traditions that link back to this vanished world. The empty stone villages continue to raise questions about survival, adaptation, and why entire communities walked away from the places they had built with such care. The haunted Stanley Hotel. In the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, just outside Estates Park, the Stanley Hotel has stood since 1909. Built by inventor Freeland Oscar Stanley, it was meant to bring East Coast luxury to a rugged Western landscape. Guests at the time marveled at the building scale and modern conveniences, but over the years, its reputation grew for something other than fine dining and mountain air. The Stanley became known as one of the most haunted hotels in America. One of the earliest incidents tied to its reputation happened in 1911. A gas leak filled part of the hotel with fumes, and when chambermaid Elizabeth Wilson entered room 217 with a candle, the resulting explosion destroyed much of the wing. Wilson survived against all odds and later returned to work at the hotel. Guests today still claim her presence lingers in that same room. Some wake to find their clothes folded or their belongings neatly arranged, and one couple reported that their bed was made around them while they were still inside. Unmarried couples in room 217 sometimes tell of a cold weight settling between them during the night, as if Wilson herself is enforcing old-fashioned values. The story that carried the Stanley into popular culture, though, came much later. In 1974, Stephen King and his wife stayed the night when the hotel was nearly empty at the close of the season. That night, King dreamed vividly of his young son being chased through the hallways by a living fire hose. He woke in a panic, lit a cigarette, and stared out the window into the surrounding wilderness. By the time he put the cigarette out, the idea for The Shining had taken shape. The novel and its later film adaptation made the Stanley Hotel a permanent fixture in modern folklore. Other areas of the building and grounds have their own stories. The main staircase has been called the Vortex, with psychics and guests alike describing it as a passageway for spirits. The concert hall, built for Flora Stanley, is another place tied to activity. Guests have heard piano music there at night when no one is near the instrument, and many believe it is Flora still playing. The fourth floor is perhaps the most frequently mentioned by visitors. Once used as storage and later for employees and their families, it is now a suite level. Guests often report the sounds of children running in the halls or laughter in the dark. In room 428, some have described waking to see a cowboy standing at the foot of the bed or looming in the corner. There are no records of a cowboy dying there, but locals connect the figure to Rocky Mountain Jim, a frontiersman from Estates Park's early days. Beneath the hotel lies a system of tunnels used by staff in its earliest years to move unseen between the kitchen, laundry, and main building. Visitors today sometimes claim to smell baked goods drifting through the tunnels, which are said to be haunted by the ghost of a pastry chef. Outside, the hotel's pet cemetery has its own part in the lore too. Cassie, a golden retriever buried there, is still said to be heard scratching at doors or rustling newspapers down hallways. Taken together, these stories have made the Stanley Hotel a landmark of both history and mystery. Some visitors come for the architecture and the mountain views, while others come hoping for something they cannot explain. Whether the accounts are the result of imagination, folklore, or something more, the Stanley continues to attract those drawn to its haunted reputation, and nearly every year, new stories are added to its long record of strange events. The River of Lost Souls. The story of the River of Lost Souls began with the disappearance of an entire Spanish regiment in the early colonial days. A force had been ordered out of Santa Fe to open communication with Florida, carrying with them a chest of gold meant to pay the garrisons in St. Augustine. Through the winter, they camped near what would become Trinidad, Colorado, joined by wives and families who had followed them north. When spring came, the soldiers pushed east into the canyon of the Purgatoire River, leaving their families behind and were never seen again. From that moment, speculation replaced fact. Some said they tried to descend the river by boat and were broken apart in the rapids. Others believed a sudden freshet swept them away or that they starved when supplies were lost. Some imagined indigenous people lying in ambush, taking revenge for mistreatment. Others whispered of bandits who struck without mercy, or of quicksand pulling men down into hidden channels beneath the river itself. No explanation ever satisfied because not a single man returned to tell the truth. Years later, an indigenous person recounted to a priest in Santa Fe that warriors had surrounded the regiment and destroyed it, much as Custer's command would be destroyed in Montana nearly 3 centuries later. According to the tale, the colonel, realizing the end was near, buried the chest of gold. Ever since, treasure hunters have searched the canyons for those hidden doubloons, certain that thousands of coins lie buried under soil and stone. As time went on and no word of the soldiers came, priests began to call the river El Rio de las Animas Perdidas, or the River of Lost Souls. Locals said the roar of water in the canyon was not only flood and current, but the cries of those doomed men echoing through eternity. French trappers softened the Spanish name into Purgatoire, and American bullwhackers, twisting the French still further, called it simply picket wire. Yet, among Hispano families, the old name never disappeared. They continued to offer prayers for those who had vanished along the river, keeping alive the belief that the souls of the soldiers still linger there. The legend of the regiment and its lost treasure endures to this day. Hikers, ranchers, and explorers who travel the Valley of Las Animas sometimes speak of the atmosphere of the place, as though the weight of a tragedy too old to trace still hangs in the canyon. The story has passed through centuries of retelling, blending history, faith, and folklore into one of the most enduring tales of Colorado's early past. The Legend of the Sleeping Giant. In the west, above Steamboat Springs, the long ridgeline of Elk Mountain stretches across the horizon, with its form so distinctly human that locals call it the Sleeping Giant. To people of the Yampa Valley, though, the mountain has always seemed more than a peak of stone and forest. It's a presence that watches over the valley, a figure both protective and mysterious, and its story has been carried through generations as both legend and warning. Some say the giant's outline is tied to the so-called Yampa Valley Curse, a pull that makes anyone who leaves feel compelled to return, as though the mountain itself will not let them go for long. The most cherished version of the tale, however, comes from the Ute, who once lived throughout the valley and regarded the mountain as sacred. According to this telling, a gentle giant once walked the land, a being who loved the people of the Yampa Valley and promised to protect them from harm. He was granted eternal life on the condition that he never caused injury to another living creature. For years, he kept his very vow, but peace was broken when a marauding ogre entered the valley and began to terrorize its people. Fearing for their safety, the giant lured the intruder north towards Steamboat Lake, where the ogre stumbled into quicksand and was swallowed by it. The people were safe again, yet the cost was high. By striking against another, even to defend those he cared for, the giant had broken his sacred promise. In sorrow, the people gathered for a ceremony and laid him to rest. To ensure that he would not be disturbed in his slumber, they placed rattlesnakes all around the base of his body, and the snakes have guarded him ever since. Another version, told more as a cautionary tale, recalls the time when fur trappers and settlers began to move into the Yampa Valley. Fearing their sacred mound would be defied, the Ute gathered rattlesnakes from the valley floor and released them across the giant slopes to protect the site. Even today, locals sometimes explain that this is why the sleeping giant has never been open to hikers, since the snakes are said to remain in great numbers. Whether this warning was born out of practicality, legend, or both, the belief still endures, giving the mountain an aura of danger as well as reverence. And what unites both stories is the idea that the giant's rest must be respected. In one telling, the snakes serve as protectors set there by the grateful people he saved, a living shield to preserve his peace. In the other, they are defenders against trespassers, meant to keep outsiders from disturbing sacred ground. Each reflects a different truth, but leads to the same conclusion, that the mountain is not simply a ridge of rock, but a presence bound by memory and oath, and those who approach it should do so with care. But yeah, in general, for the people who live in Steamboat today, the mountain is part of everyday life. Its outline is visible from town, a giant stretch across the western horizon. At sunset, when the slopes turn orange and purple, the figure seems almost lifelike, resting against the fading sky. Locals still pass on the story, sometimes to children as a tale of kindness and consequence, and sometimes to visitors as an explanation for why the mound should be left undisturbed. Molly Brown House. Tucked into Denver's Capitol Hill, the Molly Brown House looks every bit the Victorian survivor it is. Built in the 1880s and swept into local legend after Margaret Molly Brown bought it in 1894, the place carries the feel of a home that's seen fortunes made, fashions change, and one very stubborn woman refuse to be defined by a single night at sea. Step through the front door and the museum polish is there, yet so is the sense that its original owners never fully left. People notice small, telling things first. A sweet, smoky note curls through a room where no one's allowed to light up, and staff quietly chalk it up to J.J. Brown's pipe. Bulbs work loose for no good reason, so workers make rounds to tighten them again. Chairs set at slightly different angles than they did an hour earlier. Every so often, someone catches the outline of a woman in period dress shifting a piece of furniture, and no one can agree if it's Molly herself or one of the many caretakers who kept the house running. Her presence is also most often felt upstairs. Visitors describe a sudden chill in Molly's bedroom and the quick glimpse of a figure slipping around a corner. In her daughter Catherine Ellen's room, blinds lift and fall without a hand on the cord. Near the first floor stairs, a dour-faced servant sometimes stares back from a mirror that should only show the living. But yeah, the backstory gives all these experiences some weight. Isaac and Mary Large built the house with the newest comforts of their day, then the silver crash of 1893 forced a sale. The Browns moved in, and when they weren't off traveling the world, lent the home to others, including Governor James Orman while the state mansion was being remodeled in 1902. Decades later, after boarding house years and hard wear, the city nearly tore it down. Historic Denver stepped in during 1970 to save and restore it, using photographs and old finishes to bring the rooms back. The result is a museum that doubles as a memory palace. Molly's legend, of course, stretches far beyond these walls. She loaded lifeboats on the Titanic, pressed to search for survivors, and spent the rest of her life raising money, organizing relief, and pushing for reforms. That resolve is the thread that ties it all together. If she could insist on turning back toward a sinking ship, it's said that it's not hard to imagine her circling the home she loved, making sure the lights work, the chairs sit right, and her visitors feel looked after. Gold Camp Road Tunnels. The Gold Camp Road Tunnels near Colorado Springs are remembered today as much for their ghost stories as for their history. The route began in the late 1800s when crews carved 9 tunnels through the mountains to carry the short line railroad between Cripple Creek's gold mines and Colorado Springs. The line opened in 1901 and for years hauled both freight and passengers across the steep terrain. By the 1920s, when rail use declined, the tracks were pulled up and the route was converted into a toll road for cars. It became a free public road in 1939 and then remained open until the 1980s when Tunnel 3 partially collapsed. That section never reopened to vehicles, though hikers still visit the site. The collapse of Tunnel 3 became the focus of one of Colorado's most persistent urban legends. According to the tale, a school bus full of children was inside when the tunnel gave way, crushing them instantly. While no official record though of such an accident exists, the story has fueled countless reports of strange activity. Visitors describe hearing children's laughter or screams echoing through the tunnel's remains, and drivers say small handprints sometimes appear in the dust on their cars after passing nearby. Even without proof of the tragedy, the legend continues to define the tunnel's reputation. Tunnel 2 is considered the most haunted of the surviving passages. People claim that when they leave their cars in neutral inside, an unseen force pushes them uphill. Some drivers even say they later discovered handprints on the back of their vehicles. Others tell of a shadowy figure pacing inside the tunnel, said to shove cars slowly away if they stop too long. Beyond the tunnels themselves, stories circulate of hooded figures carrying torches along the road at night. But yeah, the history of the road has its own share of tragedy too. Men died blasting the tunnels during construction, and sharp curves and loose gravel have caused deadly accidents over the years. Local officials note that wrecked vehicles still rest below certain stretches of the road. These real events blur with the legends, hence giving the hauntings a measure of plausibility. Today, the first 2 tunnels remain open to cars, though their narrow interiors allow only one vehicle at a time. Tunnel 3, now sealed, can be reached by hiking or biking from the Upper Gold Camp parking lot. Beyond it, the road continues into the forest toward Victor and Cripple Creek, passing through the last of the 9 tunnels. By day, the route offers sandstone spires, mountain views, and forest trails. At night, the darkness of the passageways and the weight of their stories leave visitors with something very different, the uneasy sense that history here has not entirely gone quiet. Slide Rock Boulder. Lumberjacks working the high country told of a creature that made its home only on the steepest Colorado peaks, choosing slopes so sharp they pitched past 45 degrees. They called it the Slide Rock Boulder and described an animal built like a land-bound fish with a blunt, oversized head, small set eyes, and a mouth that reminded some of a sculpin. The tail was the part no one forgot. It split into a dolphin-like fluke that ended in heavy grab hooks, and those hooks let the creature hang from a ridgeline as if it were anchored to the mountain itself. Once fixed to a crest, the bolter would stay still for days, staring down the gulch below and waiting for tourists or any creature unlucky enough to wander into view. The way it hunted sounded less like a chase and more like a release. When the moment came, the tail lifted, the hooks let go, and the whole body gave itself to gravity. Grease was said to run from the corners of its mouth as it started down the grade, slicking the rock and helping that huge bulk gain speed. It slid with its jaws open and scooped up whatever lay in its path, then carried its momentum across the valley and up the next slope until it could fasten its tail to a new ridge and begin the watch all over again. The stories claimed whole parties were swallowed in one pass. Others focused on what it did to the land, saying spruce-covered slopes were left torn and flattened, the trees wrenched out by the roots or mound down clean as if a giant scythe had passed through. One tale fixed the creature to the country between the Ophir Peaks and Lizard Head, where a forest ranger decided to turn the bolter's speed against it. He dressed a dummy in a plaid Norfolk jacket and knee breeches, put a Colorado guidebook in its hands, and packed the figure with powder and fulminate caps. The false tourist stood where it would be seen. A bolter that had been hanging for days on Lizard Head finally launched, and the bait worked too well. The blast that followed was said to have flattened half the buildings in the town of Rico, and those structures were never rebuilt. That summer, according to the story, the remains left on the mountain fed the buzzards for weeks. But yeah, writers placed the Slide Rock Bolter squarely in the tradition of fearsome critters, the collection of tall but detailed creatures that moved through the oral culture of loggers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Later retellings kept the core image and sometimes pushed it even further. A modern horror-styled remake of the old fearsome creatures material imagined the bolter as an immense landfish weighing around 25,000 pounds, with fins to stabilize it, a hooked caudal fin for anchoring, and even 3 chitinous razor-toothed gizzards to grind whatever it had swallowed. But yeah, in general, the creature appears in early 20th century collections of logger lore such as William T. Cox's The Fearsome Creatures of the Lumberwoods, where a short entry captures both the geography and the method of the creature. Vampire Grave of Lafayette. Parents in Lafayette once had a simple way to get their kids home before the street lights flicked on. They warned them that a vampire lay buried in the town cemetery and that if they lingered after dark, he might rise and come looking. The story took root in the 1950s, the same way La Llorona has long been used in Hispanic communities to keep children close to home, and it grew around a real grave with a name that made the tale easy to believe. The marker in the Potter's Field section carries the words "born in Transylvania" for a Romanian coal miner named Theodore, often rendered as Fodor Glava, who died in 1918. In a town where many families worked the Simpson mine and knew how quickly life could turn, the single word Transylvania was enough to set imaginations racing, and parents found that the warning worked. Theodor Glava had come from Lesnik in the Transylvania region of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and followed the trail of work to America, first to the coal country of West Virginia and then to Colorado's northern field. In Lafayette, he shoveled coal for a wage, roomed in nearby Canfield, and like many immigrants, sent savings home. In early December 1918, he died after several weeks of illness, almost certainly a victim of the influenza that year. Estate papers kept in Denver show that he was emballed, laid in a simple casket, and buried in the city cemetery 2 days after his death. The records note no relatives in Colorado. They also show that his friend John Long handled the estate, that he had cash, bonds, and savings certificates worth about $2,000 at the time, and that the money due to his wife Sophia and daughter Victoria was transferred to a Romanian bank. Nothing in those papers hints at anything unusual, and nothing suggests a hurried or secret interment. His grave is beside another Romanian miner, John Trandafir, who died 2 days later. The men were not related, but they shared a workplace, a language, and in the end, a marker. The stone is poured concrete, the letters scratched in while it cured, with Austro-Hungaria across the bottom and their birthplaces above, Transylvania on one side and a Bukovina town on the other. Locals say it was made by a friend named George Lazar, and the blocky lettering on his later draft card matches the hand on the slab. The marker straddles the line between two separate plots, Glava to the right as you face it, and Trandafir to the left. Undertaker bills from the time list both men in caskets, each lowered into an outside box, which means the graves would have been dug side by side with a small margin between. In that thin strip of earth, a juniper now rises, and over the years, more than one visitor has looked at that tree and said it must have grown from the wooden stake that locals supposedly drove into Glava's heart. The story did not end there though. In later retellings, the rosebush that once ran wild over the grave was said to have sprung from his fingernails, even though old-timers remember the flowers as yellow rather than blood red. Some versions add that local youth saw a tall figure with red eyes walking near the stone. A 1993 feature in the Rocky Mountain News quoted a 19-year-old Sonic Drive-In employee who called himself a vampirologist and repeated a more ornate plot, complete with a bite that turned Glava, a murdered wife, a neighbor with a stake, a barnyard cornering, and a soul that rises on full moons. The internet helped spread these layers in the 1990s, and by the 2000s, the grave drew visitors from across the country, some of which left their own offerings: fresh flowers, coins, sunglasses, bubblegum, even a plastic chicken. A local magazine walked through the site in 2021 and described the trinkets piled there, small tokens for a man most people knew only as a character in a tale. Town records and estate files though quietly pushed back. They show that Glava was embalmed and then buried, that his funeral expenses included a minister and singers, and that the two Romanians were interred on different days in their own plots. The undertaker charged separately for opening and filling each grave. The idea that a mob dug him up and hammered wood into his chest finds no support in the paperwork, and people who worked in the cemetery for years say they never saw anything out of the ordinary. Older residents remember the vampire mostly as a playground whisper, a dare that sent kids cutting through the cemetery to sneak into football games without paying, and a warning delivered by mothers who wanted their children home before sundown. The detail about a tree growing from a stake seems to have become popular when Christopher Lee's vampire films arrived at local drive-ins, and as the legend moved from porch talk to print, reporters and psychics added their own flourishes. One article even quoted a city clerk uncertain about who lay in the grave and a headstone setter who swore you could see the vampire at midnight sitting on the stone. Modern write-ups try to balance the story with the facts. Atlas Obscura notes that a pale, tall miner from Transylvania invited suspicion among settlers who didn't know him, and that the signs people claimed to see on a dug-up body, blood at the mouth, long nails, prominent teeth, are all normal effects of decay. A county curator points out the obvious connection to Dracula in the popular imagination too. And a local historian, after years of sifting through receipts, maps, and family accounts, lays out the paper trail clearly enough to separate what can be proven from what can only be said to have been heard. He even traces how the concrete marker likely came to be and why the juniper almost certainly took hold in the narrow strip between two coffin boxes rather than in a chest.